first African Baptist church of Savannah, Georgia, was constructed in the dark of night by slaves, for slaves, using lantern light after suffering through yet another day of labor in the fields. Founded in 1773, it is the oldest black congregation in North America. From these humble beginnings grew one of the most dynamic forces for change in our nation's history, the African American Church. Nurtured in the soil of prejudice and contempt, the black church in America still flourished until almost 200 years later, it took its place on the front lines of a social, political, and ultimately spiritual battlefield, the modern civil rights movement.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities.
I think the African American Church was the bedrock of the entire civil rights movement. It was ours, and we could do in it what we wanted to do.
One must understand that at the foundation of the civil rights movement is the church. Perhaps it is the movement.
Someone said, without the black church, black Americans wouldn't have had a prayer, and that's very true.
There's a sense in which the civil rights movement was of the church in action. We saw it necessary to break down that legal dividing wall that separated black and white.
Our faith rested on the power of God, and we believed that He was leading us, and that the battle was really not ours, it was the Lord's.
The civil rights movement was primarily a religious movement, a movement of people who believed in God and who were convinced that God would help them overcome segregation.
And because they understood and believed that there was something beyond this life, they were willing to lay their lives on the line to make it happen.
It was to redeem the very soul of America, to change people, to bring about what I like to call a nonviolent revolution, a revolution of the spirit, a revolution in the minds and hearts and souls of people.
Glory, hallelujah! Glory, hallelujah! Glory, hallelujah! This truth is marching on. Shall not be moved.
As I look through the Bible and understand God and His place in human history, I understand that God owns everything.
In 1877, the Second Colored Baptist Church was founded in Montgomery, Alabama, by a handful of members who withdrew from the Columbus Street Baptist Church. The congregation first met in the old slaveholding pens on Market Street. Later, when the street's name was changed to Dexter Avenue, the church became known as Dexter Avenue Baptist Church.
And we would find our life filled with far less stress if we would get on God's agenda. Amen.
Dexter was really just one of those unique phenomenons in American history. A church that was birthed in a slave trader's pen, held its first worship services there. And so to rise from an institution of bondage to become symbolic and synonymous with freedom and liberty is just one of those ironies of history.
In 1885, the present church building was erected on a prime lot 1 block from the state capitol, an opportunity provided by the Reconstruction era in Alabama. Dexter Avenue Baptist Church had begun to change. The church of the slave pens was becoming something quite different.
The Dexter Avenue Church was what people in the black community called a class African-American church.
Dexter was a very hoi polloi church.
I think even the janitor had a college education.
I think certainly at one point it had a higher percentage of professional people than other churches in the Montgomery arena.
It was a church where there was structured worship. It was not a church where there was a tremendous amount of emotionalism. But it was, even though what the black community called a class church, a church that had been involved in the community.
By 1952, the pulpit at Dexter Avenue was vacant. The church's controversial pastor, Reverend Vernon Johns, had resigned under pressure.
And Johns had conducted almost a one-man crusade against injustice in the city. A black was killed in Montgomery, and he put on the marquee of the church that his sermon title was going to be, is it all right to kill, quote, a nigger, unquote, in Montgomery? A very fearless kind of man, but not a good pastor.
On January 17, 1954, the church invited a 25-year-old doctoral candidate from Boston University to preach a trial sermon. His name was Martin Luther King, Jr., son of the legendary pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta.
After going to Crozier Divinity School, he went to Boston University and got a PhD in theology and philosophy of religion. But it was highly unlikely that a young PhD theologian would end up in a church of 200 or 300 members like Dexter Avenue.
Deacon R.D. Nesbitt Sr. Discovered him and brought him to Montgomery for his first pulpit interview.
He was back there eating pork chops. That was his favorite dish. And I introduced myself to him and told him my mission. His daddy was still in the den. And his daddy said, Mike, you don't want to go to that big nigger church, they ain't going to do nothing but kick you out. Just like that. I said, oh, my goodness, where he is. Why would he say that?
His daddy wanted him to stay here in Atlanta and be his assistant. And Ebenezer at that time had 3,000 or so members. But he wanted to be on his own.
I think it was interesting that Dr. King's visit to Montgomery and ultimately his pastorate here at Dexter was simply to lead a congregation and to be involved in perhaps an academic career. Certainly had no idea that he would end up leading an international movement.
And I think he chose Montgomery because he thought it was a sleepy little southern town where he could, first of all, finish his PhD dissertation, but then where he could really develop his preaching skills and study and learn from people how to pastor a church. He did all of that, but about 2 weeks after he mailed in his dissertation, Rosa Parks sat down in the bus.
Come on up, you better come on up.
Oh, yeah. Today in Montgomery, city buses move through the streets almost unnoticed. Passengers pay their fares and sit where they please. In the Alabama of the early 1950s, this was not the case. Segregation laws relegated black passengers to seats at the back of the bus. On December 1st, 1955, a 42-year-old African-American seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to yield her seat in the front row of the colored section to a white man. She was arrested in front of the Empire Theater, now the site of the Rosa Parks Library and Museum.
Rosa had no idea that in doing what she did would affect the world in the end. She had no idea. She didn't know what was going to happen. She didn't know whether she would be killed or not. But there comes a time in one's life, as ML once said, if you have nothing to die for, you have nothing to live for. And that was her time.
Her refusing to get up and moved to the back of the bus was in some ways one of the most powerful single protests that the world has ever seen.
They had decided to ask everybody to stay off the buses on December the 5th because that was the day that Rosa's trial was going to be.
That morning when we woke up and those buses were empty, that's what I'm talking about when I say I believe in miracles. There was joy in the streets. People sang, they clapped, they cheered. It was a new day for Montgomery.
It was so successful, the preachers got together and we decided we were going to make 3 proposals to the bus company. They did not accept it, and we decided the bus boycott would have to continue until it was accepted.
A group of ministers and activists hastily formed an organization called the Montgomery Improvement Association to direct the boycott. One of its first orders of business was to elect a leader.
There's something about it that we can't quite explain why leaders evolve at a certain point, but I think it was ordained of God that Martin would be the leader because of his dignity, because of his great learning, because of his command of the English language, and because he represented the Black Baptist Church, which was a church that was every crossroads and hamlet in this nation.
And they all agreed on King because he was college trained, seminary trained, new in town. And so the cross was laid on him and he stood up under the cross.
I always say he didn't lead black people because they were on their way. It was almost like Gandhi said, "There go my people, I must catch them, for I am their leader."
Martin King always considered himself a Christian minister. He never considered himself a Christian minister and a civil rights worker, and that dichotomization has been the way a number of people have interpreted him. But from those of us who were in the inside and from folks in the theological discipline, he was really a minister living out the implications of the gospel.
We don't not only have a right to be free, we have a duty to be free. Yeah. And so when you sit down on the bus and you sit down in the front or you sit down by a white person, you're sitting there because you have a duty to sit there, not merely because you have a right.
3 things happened in Montgomery. The movement got its leader, Martin Luther King. The movement got its method, nonviolent, passive resistance. And the movement brought to the fore, number 3, the political power and activism and religious enthusiasm of the African American church, which was the most powerful institution in the black community.
Many churches were involved in the boycott, including First Baptist Church of Montgomery, pastored by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who would become King's closest associate. St. John's African Methodist Episcopal Church and Holt Street Baptist Church, where the first of many mass meetings would be held. In that initial meeting, speaking to a packed house, King told the audience, "If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, justice is a lie."
That night was electrifying. It was a surge of feeling that shot from one person to the next, all through the church. If we had never met again, there would still have lingered with us our purpose, our goal, and our way.
Well, the church has played a tremendous role in the bus boycott. We had what we call mass meetings every Monday night.
The civil rights movement, as has been said, is no more than a series of prayer meetings and preachings and sermons which inspired people to protest.
Ministers sold their membership on what they wanted them to do. And brother, they supported it 100%. Every Monday night, the churches were packed.
Of course, ML gets the credit for moving it and making it work. But the people who turned it over and really saw that it worked were the people, the daily workers, the people who walked to their work, The people who refused to go to work because they had no way to go there.
Walk to freedom land. Movement leaders quickly tried to organize alternative transportation, such as private carpools and church taxis. Still, many were left to walk.
I remember one morning I had a group of people taking them to work, and we were going down, I believe it was Decatur Street when we were going down, but it was pouring down rain. So I stopped and asked, I said, I can only take 2 people. I said, but if you want to ride, they said, no, we don't want to ride. We would rather walk in the rain because we're walking for freedom.
For more than a year, the bus boycott held Montgomery in its grip. The public transportation system was losing between 30,000 and 40,000 African-American fares every day. But the boycott was succeeding at a cost. Arrests were made, lawsuits filed, jobs lost, and for the first time, Dr. King and his family came under physical attack.
He was at the pulpit at First Baptist Church up there. I said, Reverend Parsons has been bummed. You have to cut your speech short because we're going to have to rush you up there.
His wife and newborn baby, Yolanda, and one of our church members were in the parsonage during that time. It was indeed a very tense moment as Dr. King left the rally and went home and found a crowd, some estimate to be as large as 5,000 people, who were quite enraged, quite inflamed, and ready to take up arms and begin to get revenge.
He raised his hands just like that, said, put your guns, your pistols, your knives, and everything away. Coretta and the baby are all right. We are still non-violent. That's all he said to them. The crowd dispersed just like that.
Everywhere he went, he preached the philosophy of nonviolence, which did not mean simply rolling over. It means facing your aggressors nonviolently and resisting them with the spirit rather than with physical weapons.
He instructed our people not to retaliate with violence, but to do it through prayer, love, and understanding. So the thing that Dr. King taught, I feel, was what caused a movement to move on and be successful.
381 days after the Montgomery bus boycott began, the Alabama State Court handed down an injunction to halt its use of carpools. Martin Luther King and the other leaders of the movement went to the courthouse to hear the decision read.
He said it was the lowest point in his life, and as he got in the courtroom, somebody passed a note from an Associated Press reporter, and there was a ripple through the courtroom, and they received notice that the Supreme Court had decided that bus segregation was unconstitutional. And he said some good sister who was there in the courtroom just got up and shouted and said, "Great God Almighty," then spoke from Washington.
So here is a man who is a scholar, teams up with a seamstress, and revolutionizes America, and gets it to live up to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which it had passed 100 years earlier.
Now, if one reads the history of revolutions, whether France or England or America, only a few people participate. All of people benefit from it, but only a few people are willing to risk their lives to honor their sacred fortune, and King was willing to do that. And he was backed up. The black church was the vehicle, was the instrument, was that trumpet, which King played so magnificently in bringing about change in America.
When Little Rock Central High School was constructed in 1927, it was the largest high school in the United States, built to accommodate 3,000 students in a single structure. The American Institute of Architects designated it the most beautiful high school in America. Academically, it was one of the country's premier institutions, the pride of Arkansas. Today, two former students have returned to Central High School. Ernest Green, managing partner of Shearson Lehman in Washington, D.C., and Melba Patilla Beals, a prize-winning author now living in California.
You know, when I go back to Central High School, every time I'm like praising the Lord. I never thought I'd live through that. So I'm just grateful.
We had no idea that this was going to be as big a deal as it turned out to be, nor did I expect it to be one of the single moments in this long line of civil rights history.
Well, I guess we're going to get into school today.
We're going to get in there today, baby.
In 1957, Ernest Green and Melba Beals made history as part of the Little Rock Nine, a group of African-American teenagers seeking to enter the previously all-white school. The nation sat transfixed before their television sets as these children brought the battle for civil rights to Arkansas.
Little Rock, though born and bred in segregation, had been a more moderate city compared to surrounding areas. Memphis, Jackson, Mississippi, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Atlanta, Georgia.
It was a fairly liberal place. And the NAACP national office felt that here was as good a place as any to create an integrated school system.
Little Rock was really the first test of the federal government's commitment to enforcing civil rights for African Americans. The Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 that racial desegregation in public schools was unconstitutional.
On September 4th, 1957, under the supervision of state and NAACP President Daisy Bates, the 9 students prepared to enter the school. While a hostile crowd watched from across the street, they arrived only to be confronted by the state militia, sent in a day earlier by Governor Orville Forbes.
Before school started, he called out the Arkansas National Guard to, as he put it, maintain order, but effectively what they did was barred the African American students from entering Central High School.
And I think that made it a significant thing in U.S. history when we had states deciding to dare the federal government to carry out the laws of the land.
That first day, Mrs. Bates arranged for the students to be escorted into the school by a group of clergymen. One of the 9, Elizabeth Eckford, who had no telephone, never learned of the plan and arrived alone.
There was nothing we could do. We couldn't cross the street. And just as we were looking and thinking we want to go across the street to help Elizabeth, we realized that we're in danger because this guy standing to the left of us says, hey, we don't have to go there. We got some nigger right here. And then this group of people start turning around. He starts enrolling people. He's got a rope around his shoulder and cross underneath like that.
This was a first for us to have to see children put on the battlefield for the good of the whole.
We're very fortunate that we didn't have a lot of bloodshed out there. But at the same time now, that was God working in the plan.
I think in many ways, had it not been for, one, our faith and our belief that God was looking over us, we wouldn't have made it through.
2 weeks later, after negotiations between Governor Faubus and President Dwight Eisenhower sort of reached a stalemate, Governor Faubus withdrew the Arkansas National Guard from around the school.
And we were taken to school by, again, by Mrs. Bates and Mr. Bates in a series of cars.
So we came out of this sunny morning into this dark school, like entering a movie late. You can't see where you're going. And all we heard was the niggers are in, the niggers are in, the niggers are in now.
It turned out that what was going on, that the mob was threatening to break through the police barricades, because then the only protection was with the Little Rock City Police.
They usher us into an office, and even as we were ushered into that office, there are people banging on the glass door. Niggers are in. They're in. Get them out of here. They're just screaming. And in the distance, even then, there's a window in the back. You could hear that crowd outside.
I went to the principal's office, and we were told that we were going to be taken out of school right away for our safety, that they were uncertain that they could hold back the mob.
I sneaked up to the door and I heard them say, "It's bad out there. What we're going to have to do is let them hang one in order to get the other 9 out." But this guy, who I believe to be that assistant chief, stood up and he said, "How are we going to choose?" He said, "I'm a father." He said, "What are we going to let them do, draw straws? I'll get them out."
And the Little Rock police weren't able to control the crowd that had gathered in front of the school to protest the desegregation. So President Eisenhower then called in units of the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and he also federalized the Arkansas National Guard and sent them to the school to control the crowds and to escort the 9 students into the school and protect them.
If the President of the United States would send soldiers to walk me into school, how much trouble am I in? And yet my grandmother said, man progresses by insight, not by sight. God has a plan. You don't know what it is. Move ahead. And I look behind me, and Ernie Green says at that time, "I guess we're going to get in today, aren't we?" And we go up the front stairs, we go in the front door. No, 2, 4, 6, 8, we ain't gonna integrate. And Terry goes, 4, 6, 8, 10, we're already in. And after we get right inside the school, we stand absolutely still. And they assign us each a guard, personal bodyguard.
We are now an occupied territory.
The problem grew out of the segregation problem, but the troops are not there as a part of the segregation problem. They are there to uphold the courts of the land. That is why they are there, and for no other purpose.
When Eisenhower federalized the National Guard until the 101st could get here, that was when this country faced its greatest crisis between who's sovereign, state rights or federal rights.
The situation in Little Rock was really the first time since Reconstruction in over 80 years that the federal government sent troops into a place to enforce African Americans' rights, and in this case, civil rights, after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
That single act, for the first time, showed African American citizens that the federal government was willing to put its might and power behind this court decision.
Though several congregations, both black and white, defended desegregation in Little Rock, the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church was the unquestioned leader. Still active today, the church was founded in 1863. Over the years, it has been recognized for its unflinching support of civil rights and human rights, and sometimes has paid a price for taking that stand.
You know, in 1927, they lynched a man there in Little Rock. Now, they knew what the AME Church stood for. That's everybody. He lynched him, went in Bethel Church, got furniture out there, burned him right there in front of Bethel Church, in the street.
Reverend Rufus K. Young was pastor of Bethel AME during the Central High School crisis in 1957. Long retired, Reverend Young remains an active member of the church. He is 90 years old.
God gave him equal rights. God didn't have any stepchildren. God didn't have any favorites. God is not a respecter of persons. God respects what's in your heart, what's in your soul, your mind.
He was more than just a pastor here at Bethel. He was an organizer, he was a builder, and he was a facilitator.
Reverend Young felt that he owed no allegiance to anyone except God and his church and his members. So he was not about to get on any side of an issue except what he considered to be the right side. And I think supporting the Little Rock Nine, supporting Daisy Bates, supporting her husband, L.C. Bates, was the right thing to do, and he did it.
Bethel played a very important role historically, and Reverend Young was one of the ministers who really stood up. The NAACP met there. 3 of the 9 were members of Bethel, myself, Melba, and Gloria Ray Carlsmark.
Any political power, any organizing power was vested in the church. There was nothing else for us. So of course, Bethel AME Church is my home. You know, it's my sanctity. It's my only hope of safety.
I think it was the message from the pulpit on Sunday that probably kept this town together, because Little Rock was a shame.
The Little Rock Nine met each day for prayer. We believe, as the scripture says, the prayers of the righteous availeth much. They started each day, they gathered as a group with some religious leader, ecumenical leader, that was involved in the struggle for prayer.
And we had to pray every day at 12 o'clock for those children over there. And so far, it worked out all right.
You can't underestimate the power of black prayer. That's the only thing they could do. It's the only weapon they had in their hand. They didn't have any militia. They didn't have any army. They prayed.
That was the hardest year of my life. It is very difficult to live your life so that every single day of your life you think you're going to die.
We got calls continually every night that somebody was going to have acid thrown on them, or that they were going to be shot, or they were going to not make it home the next day.
I mean, it was just clear that this was going to be a long, hard battle. And Dr. King came down and he said, look, you're doing this for generations unborn. You're not doing this for yourself. You're doing this for the children who will come after you.
It was combat, and you came in at 8:30 in the morning and you left at 3:30 in the evening, and you felt blessed by being able to get through that day.
It started to feel like every morning I would get up, get dressed, go to war. I would come home, study over and over and over again.
But the church did what it could to build up the morale and to give them the courage and the determination to go through that hell of a situation at that Central High School.
You know, one of the scriptures that I think has really helped us through the time at Central is Isaiah 40th chapter. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint.
After an agonizing year, the school term would finally end. Ernest Green, the only senior, would graduate. The following year, all public high schools in Little Rock would be closed as voters struggled for control of the school board. Today, 44 years after the Little Rock Nine first walked through the doors of Central High School, the student body is 55% African American. Now part of the National Parks Service, the school was designated a National Historic Site in 1998. 20,000 visitors pass through its museum annually.
Going to Central High School was a gift. It put a core of steel in my spine that nobody can remove. What could you call me that would frighten me today? What could you do to me that would frighten me today? And how could you ever separate me from the Lord. Because the one gift that Central High School gave me was to trust the Lord.
Kelly Ingram Park in downtown Birmingham, Alabama, was the scene of some of the most brutal encounters of the modern civil rights movement. In recent years, it has been transformed into a beautiful outdoor memorial to that struggle. Visitors strolling its sidewalks are gently reminded of the events that took place here in the early 1960s. It is a testament to change for the city of Birmingham.
Birmingham, Alabama was probably the most segregated city in the South. Everything was segregated in Birmingham.
It was said to be the Pittsburgh of the South, and it was growing so fast, it was called the Magic City. But to characterize it in race relations, it was indeed a tragic city. And some have said that it was the Johannesburg of America.
The old Bethel Baptist Church building in Birmingham is vacant now. After surviving hundreds of Sunday services, dozens of protest meetings, and 2 bombings, the church ultimately fell victim to time and progress. A new, much larger facility was built a few blocks away in 1997. But in its day, this now quiet sanctuary thundered for freedom. The man in its pulpit was the Reverend Fred Lee Shuttlesworth.
Fred Shuttlesworth is one of the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. Without a Fred Shuttlesworth, I'm not so sure there would have been a Birmingham movement.
There's no question that in Birmingham, he was the heart and soul of the movement. His dedication, but most of all, his sense of divine destiny that God had put him here.
We will have no alternative but again to present our very bodies in nonviolent demonstrations in order to place this issue before the conscience of this nation.
I like that phrase in Hebrews where it said God moves at sundry times, periodic times in history. He just moves. It's time to move. And of course, he fires the hearts of somebody. And I guess that somebody in Birmingham had to be me, because I always thought that segregation was wrong.
But the NAACP was outlawed in Alabama. And Shuttlesworth decided to form an organization to continue the work of the NAACP.
And he made the statement, they killed the old hen, but before she died, she had some biddies. And the Alabama Christian movement turned out to be a fighting rooster.
Keep on a-walking, keep on a-talking, marching to the freedom. Walk, walk, walk.
Of all the civil rights leaders, Shuttlesworth may have been the most courageous.
He never sent you into the face of danger. He led you into the face of danger. And of course, you didn't have time to think about it too much. All you thought about was freedom.
But he announced that he was going to integrate Phillips High School, which is in downtown Birmingham. Announcing that, a mob was there to meet him. He was beaten with chains. His wife was stabbed. I have heard him say that if he had been hit one more time, he probably would have died.
And one day I said to him, Fred, it looked like you're trying to get us killed. He said, well, if we die, then our lives will be one installment on the payment for freedom.
Shortly after the movement began, his home was bombed.
The corner of the house was blown off. The walls between my head and the dynamite was blown away, maybe 20 more feet.
A group of several hundred people came to his home. And when Shuttlesworth came to the door, one lady proclaimed, and this has been recorded by historians, he's all right, and he's going to be all right. God saved the Reverend to lead the movement.
Well, that meant that the fight was on. And I mean the fight was on, and I intended to carry the fight to the enemy. But from that night, we challenged every segment, everything that was segregated. We deliberately put ourselves in the teeth of danger, because I knew if God could deliver me from that, I had no more problems.
In Birmingham, every Monday night was movement night. And the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, Shellsworth group, went from church to church in the community.
We had a large number of churches that worked with us and opened their doors in order that we might have mass meetings.
In 1963, Shellsworth invited Martin Luther King and his organization to come to Birmingham.
And Martin said, well, let me think about it. And he said, well, we've been thinking about it long enough. Either I'm going ahead by myself, you all can go with me, or I'm going ahead by myself on this one.
Fred was rough and ready, but King was somewhat more sophisticated, and he had a way with some of the people that looked down and saw the scorned Reverend Shuttlesworth.
When King came in 1963, the larger churches became a part of the movement. And that's when 16th Street and 6th Avenue, the two largest sanctuaries in the city, became frequent meeting places.
The 16th Street Baptist Church is located across the street from Ken Ingram Park. Because of its strategic location in downtown Birmingham, it became the focus of activity late in the movement. Mass meetings were held regularly, and protest marches often began and ended at 16th Street.
May mean going to jail, but I'm going if it means that. It may even mean physical death, but if it means that I will die standing up for the freedom of my people.
Both King and Shuttlesworth would really lift us, and we were ready to even face Satan in hell, and we would march out.
A decision was made to include young people in the marches. That brought hundreds, if not thousands, of new participants into the civil rights movement in Birmingham.
And so we had a mighty army, and they were ready to go to jail. And of course, King was criticized and said, you might get these young folk hurt. And of course, King said they've already been hurt. The Southern way of life, injustice, racism has hurt them.
I was 14, but it was clear what we were standing up for. And I think I was a little amazed that someone thought that I could contribute something.
You would have these meetings at 16th Street Baptist Church. After these meetings, young people by the hundreds would come out of these churches and march into the city.
We were told about the dogs and the billy clubs and the things that the policeman might do. He might push you, he might spit on you, but we were always told that we could not retaliate. We had to be nonviolent.
And they told us if they slap you, don't slap back. If they spit on you, take your handkerchief, smile, and wipe it off. If they put a cigarette, lighted cigarette butt down your back, just shake that thing until you shake it out. Regardless of what happened, don't fight back.
Frustrated by this enormous army of people protesting segregation and discrimination in the city, Police Commissioner Bull Connor unleashed dogs and fire hoses on the young people.
Some of us were carrying signs. And I think just in the next couple of seconds, I remember just a flood of policemen and dogs. And then all of a sudden, there were people with water hoses. But it swiped the side of my face, took some of my hair out, and it hurt. It was a painful swipe.
And of course, I was struck with fire hoses too, you know. Those fire hoses would knock the bark off a tree 75 feet away. So powerful.
We had been beaten, we had been thrown in jail, we'd been the victims of the dogs and the fire hose. But actually, we thought that was a small price to pay to change the world in which we lived.
Without the young people, we would not have had the success that we needed. Fill up all of the jails. And when they had no more jails and juvenile detention places, they took them to the fairground.
The climax of the movement was that the jails were full. And the judge said to me that morning, he said, Mr. Shuttlesworth, I regret to announce that due to the overcrowded conditions of the jail, I cannot sentence you this morning. I said, Your Honor, we're making progress.
When they put that next 100 in there, let them know that they got another 1,000 to put in there. When they put that 1,000 in there, let them know that they got 10,000 more to put in there.
Never before in the history had you had those kind of people rising up saying, we are not going to take it no more. Put the dogs on us, but we have a freedom that the dogs can't bite out. We have a spirit of freedom that the billy clubs cannot beat out. We have a spirit of freedom that the water hoses cannot wash out. We have a spirit of freedom that the dynamite cannot blast out. And God knows the jail cannot lock it out. We want freedom. And before we be a slave, we'd be buried in our grave.
Tragic events over the past few months.
In May of 1963, civil rights leaders made an uneasy truce with the city of Birmingham, pending the desegregation of lunch counters, restrooms, and drinking fountains. In August, the nation was temporarily distracted by the March on Washington. By the end of the summer, the 16th Street Baptist Church had resumed its typical Sunday morning routine. Carolyn McKinstry, then 14 years old, was secretary of her Sunday school class. Turning in the attendance report would save her life.
It was Youth Day. Most of our youth were dressed in white. On our signage out front, we had the Sunday school lesson for the day, which was A Love That Forgives.
And the children that had been in those Sunday school classes and left a little early to get dressed to take their part at the 11 o'clock worship service, they weren't trying to be rude and leaving their class early, but they were just excited about what they had to do, and they wanted to be prepared to do it.
And the girls were in the room kind of primping and laughing and combing hair and doing all those things that girls like to do. And I spoke and didn't really tarry at the door, but primarily because I had my materials and I took that job kind of seriously. I felt very important.
A peaceful day, a beautiful day, people in Sunday school, and 4 children in the ladies' restroom getting ready for a program, and all of a sudden, chaos.
Time Sunday school teacher started teaching, we heard a noise, booms, sound like clouds burst.
The windows just all came crashing in. And I remember hearing screams and people sort of scuttling about in the church.
It was just like a war zone, so to speak. People hollering, crying, running, trying to find their children and their relatives.
When I got there, I could smell the smoke of the dynamite. And my heart was in my mouth. And I went to the corner of the church where I could look down where the gaping hole was, and that people were going in and out and bringing things out of that gaping hole. And there was weeping and screaming.
We searched that pile of rubbish, and after about 3 minutes of digging into it, we found the first body. And I didn't recognize who it was. They were so mutilated. And we found the second body, the third body, and the fourth body.
When I got in, I stood right there on that corner, and I saw nothing but bloody sheets coming out, and mothers were standing on the steps, pulling out their hair.
4 girls: Denise McNair, Carol Robinson, Addie Mae Collins, and Cynthia Wesley were killed in the blast. The bombing would later be attributed to the Ku Klux Klan.
The bombing of this church has often been referred to as the bomb that was heard around the world. And we believe that it was, so much so that the reaction of the rest of the world is what shamed the people of Birmingham.
That day, at 10:22, that Sunday morning, changed America. It's been changed ever since, and still changing.
It might have been one of the things that disgusted many of the good people, white people, who did not support the movement, but who suddenly realized that they would rather be on the same side with these little girls in church on Sunday morning than on the racists that were bombing churches.
It was a way of opening their eyes of the white race. It was a way. I said, God is in everything. Everything.
Within a year of the bombing at 16th Street Baptist Church, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. Once again, a terrible price had been paid for freedom.
I urge every American to join in this effort to bring justice and hope to all our people and to bring peace to our land.
Selma is a small town in the Black Belt of Alabama, forever destined to be connected with 2 major events in American history: the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. One in the 1860s, the other a century later. Block after block of gracious antebellum homes in Selma suggest that earlier era when cotton was king. Cemeteries offer a continuing tribute to the Confederate dead. But standing alongside these memorable relics are 2 of the enduring symbols of the modern civil rights movement. One is the Edmund Pettus Bridge, site of perhaps the single most recognizable battle in the struggle for African American rights. The other, Brown Chapel AME Church. Sometimes war room, sometimes prayer room, sometimes schoolroom, locker room, hospital, and house of God for a people reaching for one of the last freedoms denied them, the right to vote.
Whereas in Birmingham, we were talking public accommodations, largely. In Selma, we were talking about the right to vote. A right which, though it was declared in the 15th Amendment, had not really been protected for black citizens in the South.
The population in Selma was more black than white. And even though that was the case, few blacks voted.
But in Selma, Alabama, during the 1960s, especially during the early 60s, you had a black voting age population where only 2.1% of blacks were registered to vote. You had to pass a so-called literacy test.
I had one particular one where they were talking about the jelly bean, have jelly beans in a jar, and you had to guess how many there were. If you could not guess it, then you couldn't get the vote. So basically nobody got to vote because they couldn't guess the number of jelly beans that were in the jar.
People were asked to recite parts of the Constitution or write parts of the Constitution, and all kinds of questions that it was known that they would not be able to answer.
So you have black ministers, lawyers, physicians, school teachers, high school principals, college professors flunking the so-called literacy test.
The poll taxes were a problem also, because poor people and that didn't have a color were just denied that because they couldn't afford it.
And at a particular point in Selma's history, the people of Selma, with its leaders, decided that they would rise up and try to bring into reality the guaranteed rights that the Constitution offered.
The first mass meeting was held at Tabernacle Baptist Church down on Broad Street. But after the members and the pastor of that particular church saw the ramifications of what was fixing to happen, I think a little fear began to creep up and take over. So they began to look for another place where people, black people, could meet that belonged to black people. They could not be as intimidated. So the movement came to Brown Chapel.
Today marks the beginning of a determined, organized, mobilized campaign to get the right to vote all over this state.
The reason Brown Chapel was chosen was a strategic reason. Number one, it's located right in the middle of the housing projects.
It was probably the closest church to downtown, and so we made it our headquarters.
Any given night, there would be 1,500 people in and about and around. Outside, just as many. The people would come to hear, because in their heart, in their gut, in their mind, in their very essence, what was going on, they knew was right. And it was what God wanted us to do.
I was a youngster, but what I remember was all marches started with a mass meeting. And there again, we had prayer, and we had singing, lots of singing.
It was very much like a revival meeting with great singing and great oratory, great preaching, great testimonies, so that it was a spiritual experience.
The mass meeting were always the time to actually be reminded of our Christian responsibility and the foundation, the Christian foundation, around which this movement was built, really.
I also think it was divine intervention that the churches played such a major role. We needed that spirituality. We needed that religious fervor. We needed to feel the presence of God, and we needed to know that Jesus was walking with us as we walked every day.
We are going to walk the highways of this state, until all of the officials around will know that God has a day in mind, and he has a plan in mind. A day when every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together.
Well, a lot of the mass meetings were held prior to the marches to the courthouse to register to vote. And the adults would come for the mass meeting, and then they would line up here at the church and march all the way to the courthouse in mass.
There was never a day that before we began a mass meeting or began any type of direct action, we had prayer.
This prayer we ask in Jesus' name and for his sake. Amen.
God was the one that we were looking to lead us through very difficult and uncertain and unseen times.
Though Brown Chapel was most visible in the voting rights movement, a number of other churches played significant roles. Ebenezer Baptist Church, Ward Chapel, AME, and First Baptist, located within the same city block as Brown Chapel. These two congregations worked hand in hand in 1965. Brown Chapel as the headquarters for Dr. King and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference. First Baptist as the command center for John Lewis's Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which organized and directed the youth movement.
But they will come after school, they will train them to do the kinds of things that they needed to do. They learned the freedom songs, and then they began to set up guidelines and strategies by which they will begin to affect the movement.
And I can remember coming out of First Baptist sometimes at night, and the church would be ringed with people from the White Citizens Council, or they would be standing across the street with guns.
Youth played a huge part in this movement. I went to jail 13 times, and I was only 11 years old. Nobody ever asked me, and it was the thing to do.
On March 7th, 1965, images of the Edmund Pettus Bridge would be seared into America's collective conscience. Overnight, the world would become aware of Selma, Alabama. The catalyst for this event occurred more than 2 weeks earlier.
One night, a few miles from Selma, in a little town called Marion, Alabama, in Perry County, a young black man went down and attempted to lead a march, and a confrontation occurred. He tried to protect one of his elderly grandparents, and he was shot in the stomach by a state trooper, and a few days later he died at the Good Samaritan Hospital in Selma.
The civil rights leadership of King and others in Selma decided that they would march to Montgomery to lay before Governor Wallace the injustice of this act and the injustice of voting discrimination.
Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy were determined to be in that church the first Sunday in March. And so we had scheduled the march officially for the second Sunday. But the word got out in rural areas that we were marching to Montgomery. So several hundred people showed up on the first Sunday.
There had been no pre-planning. It had been in discussion. But the go-ahead to do the march did not come until that Sunday morning.
We assembled right next to Brown Chapel in preparation to march, and for the first time, there were not a lot of police around. As a matter of fact, I don't remember seeing any police officers.
They started toward Montgomery, and of course, to get from Selma to Montgomery, you have to go over the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
So we walked through the streets of Selma, no one saying a word. It was orderly, peaceful, almost in a prayerful manner.
And on that particular day, we marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge here, and When I got to the apex of that bridge, I looked down on the other side, and I saw a sea of blue helmets, blue state trooper uniform.
And we continued to walk. We came within hearing distance of the state troopers, and a man identified himself and said, "I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march, and it will not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your church." And Jose Williams, standing beside me, said, "Major Cloud, can we kneel and pray?" And before we can pass word back to the crowd to kneel and pray, Major John Cloud said, "Troopers, advance."
And then they literally, with force, ran down the line of marchers, toppling those marchers over as if you would topple bowling pins in a bowling alley. And then they began to beat heads.
Before I could turn and run, the front was upon us. They had turned around, fleeing. The policemen swinging billy clubs and riding horses just running over people like they wasn't even there.
You saw these men putting on their gas masks. Then they came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, bullwhips, trampling us with horses, and releasing the tear gas.
The last thing I remember on the bridge, when I could see, was seeing this horse just run right over this lady, just full speed, just wham. And her head hitting that pavement was too much. I fainted.
Pandemonium broke out in the crowd of marchers, and I could see blood flowing. They were pursued all the way back to Brown Chapel Church.
My sister Linda was over me, and she was just crying and crying and crying. And blood was falling on my face. I thought it was her tears.
I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick and knocked down. I had a concussion at the bridge. I thought I was going to die.
It was carnage, absolute carnage.
You would think it would have stopped at the bridge, but it just didn't stop at the bridge. It went back to the projects.
I remember vividly people running back towards the bridge. They were running towards the church. I remember horses, men on horses, beating the people as they ran. I can see the horses as they rode up the steps of the church and actually went up on the porch.
We had terror all night. They call it Bloody Sunday. It was Bloody Sunday and part of Monday, too.
And we got to the church. I looked into the eyes of those martyrs whose eyes I looked into many days before then, being president of that Dallas County Voters League. And I tried to give as much comfort. We had prayer. I read scripture. And we admonished all to still depend on the God that we had been serving.
But again, the cameras were there. And pictures of this went all over the nation. Yea, all over the world.
And right in the middle of the ABC movie, Bloody Sunday was shown. And what I mean by the irony of God is that everybody was glued to the TV set that night to watch the movie, and the movie was Judgment in Nuremberg. And right in the middle of Judgment in Nuremberg, here's what's happening in Selma, Alabama.
And so you saw all of these things that Hitler had done to Jews, and then you saw this happening to people in the United States. And it was really too much. And it started a movement, I think, nationally.
And so then Selma became an ecumenical gathering of all races, all nationalities, all religions. People came here. And the people of Selma opened their doors and let these people sleep in their beds. And they slept on pallets, on floors.
And more than 1,000 ministers, priests, rabbis, nuns from all over America came to that church.
There was no great call that went out. They just showed up. We used to sing a song, they're coming by the bus and the airplanes too. They would even walk if we asked them to.
We looked up, and coming down both aisles in Brown Chapel were clergy people from every denomination, from every race, and it was a beautiful sight. They were from not just the United States, but from foreign countries, and they had come to help.
Immediately following the events of Bloody Sunday, Dr. King applied for, and was granted, a court order allowing a march between Selma and Montgomery. On March 21st, 1965, President Johnson enlisted 2,000 U.S. Army troops, 1,800 Alabama National Guardsmen, 100 U.S. Marshals, and 100 more FBI agents to protect those marching along the 54-mile route.
There were so many people down here that day. I looked out over and I said to myself, where did all these people come from?
Selma and the march from Selma to Montgomery for me represented the greatest moment, the highest moment, the best moment of the civil rights movement. And that march was like a holy march. It was like no march I ever witnessed before, no march I witnessed after. It was like, maybe like Gunner's March to the Sea. But it was something that was so beautiful, almost sacred. It was like we were walking up a holy highway. It was like we were walking on holy ground.
You had a feeling of great jubilation that now all the sacrifices that you had made had been worth it all.
And because of that and other things, President Lyndon Johnson went on television and said he was putting before Congress an act that would do away with all discrimination in voting. And so the 1965 Voting Rights Act came as a result of Selma, Alabama.
It was a day of celebration. It was a day of liberation. It transformed American politics, transformed our country, and we will never, ever be the same because of that one act.
In 1894, Reverend A.D. Williams became pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. At his death in 1931, his son-in-law, Martin Luther King Sr., assumed the pastorate. Then, in 1960, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. returned to Ebenezer to co-pastor the church with his father.
We have to remember that in theological circles, when Dr. King was preaching and doing what he was doing, people at Vanderbilt University was talking about God is dead. And you had a number of outstanding theologians who were saying God is dead. But Martin turned that around, picked up the gospel, took it into the street, and said, no, God is quite alive. He is concerned about justice. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And he inculcated that in everything he did from Montgomery to Memphis.
I have always believed that God will send the leader when you need him and will leave him there as long as you need him. And that's what I've always thought about Martin. We needed someone.
After significant victories in Birmingham and Selma, Martin Luther King Jr. found himself faced with the question, what's left?
But it was also true that Dr. King had shifted his emphasis from civil rights to economic rights. He was talking about organizing union workers. He was talking about lifting minimum wages to a point of decency. Also, he had been a pretty stout critic of the war in Vietnam.
When he took his stand against the Vietnam War, many of his friends forsook him, and he was demonized by the federal government, branches of the federal government, and lived under this constant pressure all the time.
So the euphoria that was around him at first, the joy that was around him, sort of died out as he got into these hotter issues and where he challenged U.S. capitalism and the way we make money.
In 1968, a situation developed that fit perfectly with Martin Luther King's new emphasis on economic reform. Garbage workers in Memphis, Tennessee went on strike. protesting dangerous and unfair labor practices.
They were the garbage men. We didn't see them necessarily as having dreams or being the deacons in our churches or the ushers or the choir members. I mean, they were the garbage people. And they worked under terrible conditions. Very low pay. They could work all the week and the month and still come under the qualifications for welfare assistance. And so they just got tired of it. There's a sign. It doesn't say peace, it doesn't say freedom, it doesn't say justice. All it says is, I am a man. And they were affirming their humanity and their manhood.
So in Memphis, the accumulated grievances of 1,500 workers over a period of years finally erupted. And when it did, they went on strike. And they were united to such an extent that they could not break it.
The leaders had to run to catch up with the strikers. And we started having rallies and raising money and getting food and that sort of thing for them.
And in Memphis, you had Metropolitan Baptist, Claiborne Temple, AME, and Mason Temple Church of God in Christ. These were the great rallying places. Claiborne Temple AME Church was formerly the Second Presbyterian Church White, a huge Gothic cathedral, beautiful. It was what I call a staging area. It was from this site that most of the marches of the Civil Rights era, before 68 and after, started.
And when you have a movement going like that, when it's really going, you know it's time to bring in Dr. King. So we reached the point of saying it's time for Martin.
Dr. King arrived in Memphis and led a march down Beale Street into downtown. When a group of young black men at the tail of the protest began to provoke the police, a riot ensued. King's doctrine of passive, nonviolent resistance was called into question.
So in this situation, Dr. King's whole movement had been on trial from both the black and the white community. And so he felt after that day, when the march was disrupted, that he had to come back and lead a peaceful demonstration to prove to the nation, to his followers, and to his own satisfaction that his movement had not failed.
And he came back in to lead that march. He said, we've got to have a peaceful march. And that's how he happened to have been here on April 3rd.
Mason Temple in Memphis is the world headquarters for the Church of God in Christ, the second largest African-American denomination in the country. Built in 1940, it has a seating capacity of 7,500, making it the largest black-owned church auditorium in America. On April 3rd, 1968, at Mason Temple, Martin Luther King Jr. gave one of his most famous and prophetic speeches. In less than 24 hours, he would be killed.
And it was a stormy, rainy, terribly bad night. Winds howling, thunders roaring, rain falling incessantly. I mean, it sends chills up me now as I think about that night.
I think the night before he was killed, when he went to preach at Mason Temple, he'd had a fever and was feeling very bad.
And so he told Abernathy, Reverend Abernathy and Reverend Jesse Jackson and myself to go over and hold the rally, that he would stay at the motel and work on the Poor People's Campaign.
And that night at Mason Temple, it's impossible perhaps for me to even describe in words the feeling of apprehension, the dread in Memphis, the fear in Memphis, the growing divide between the races.
And Abernathy walked in, Jesse Jackson walked in, and I walked in. And the people were just clapping. And Abernathy's preacher said to him, these people are not clapping for us. They think Martin is coming in behind us. He said, I ain't making no speech tonight. He went to the phone and called Martin and said, man, you should get over here. These people have come in the weather to hear you.
We prevailed on him just to come out and say a word because he was really feeling bad. Well, when he got to talking, he went on and preached. And whether he knew that was his last sermon or not, I don't know.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
I am so certain that speech was Martin preaching himself through the fear of death. He just got it out of him.
While we were determined that we would ultimately succeed, the author and finisher of our faith died on a cross. And you always had the feeling that if you did well enough and if you were worthy, and if you pushed things hard enough and far enough, the chances are you too would suffer some sort of martyrdom.
I think the premonition was that he was an astute history student, an astute student of the political scene. And he could read that, just like Jesus had that sort of premonition when he rides into Jerusalem, that something is wrong. It's very interesting to see that in the Palm Sunday stories, he is not as jubilant as are all the people who cheer him on, because he knows what's before him. And that wasn't a premonition, that was a reading of the history.
Until the mid-60s, the Lorraine Motel in Memphis had been one of the few public accommodations available to African Americans. Martin Luther King spent his last night here, following the sermon at Mason Temple. Today, the motel houses the National Civil Rights Museum. Reverend Samuel Billy Kiles walks the corridors and balconies of this spot often and remembers the evening of April 4th, 1968.
The 4th, he was around here working, meeting, getting recommitments for nonviolence. Dinner was to be served at my home. Well, when I went to get him at the room about 4:45 or so, he said, "Oh no, we call the house and dinner is not until 6 and I'm in no hurry." But that gave me the wonderful privilege to spend the last hour on earth with him. 3 preachers in a room, Abernathy, King, and Kiles. And of the 3, I am the only one left. And so the press is always saying, "Well, what did you do?" Well, what? I said, "Well, we talk preacher talk."
And he was just about ready, but Reverend Abernathy wasn't. So he came out and stood on the balcony. And because he'd been sick the night before, I was down in the parking lot, and I said, "You probably need to go get a coat, because it's already getting pretty chilly."
I turned, I said, "Come on, guys, let's go." And I turned and walked away. I got about 5 steps. Pow! The shot rang out. I looked straight ahead over the balcony. People were ducking behind cars because they didn't know if he'd continue to shoot. I looked back, and Martin had been knocked from the railing back on the balcony.
And then when I looked up and didn't see him, my first reaction was he's still clowning. But I saw his shoes sticking out from under the banister.
And the police by this time were coming toward us, drawing their guns. And I hollered to them, "Call an ambulance on your police radio. Dr. King has been shot." And they responded, "Where did the shot come from?" So there's a picture with several of us pointing in response to the police saying, where did the shot come from?
And he was laying there very peacefully, and frankly, my first reaction was that he deserved the rest, and that if anybody had earned the right to go on to a life beyond and receive whatever reward was his, he'd done it.
And I was there to be a witness, and my witness has to be true, that Martin Luther King Jr. didn't die in some foolish way. He didn't overdose. He wasn't shot by a jealous lover. He wasn't shot leaving the scene of a crime. He was a man with a PhD degree earned, with a Nobel Peace Prize, oratorical skills second to none, and yet he died helping garbage workers. And so that's my witness. And they said, we shall shoot that dreamer, and then we'll see what happens to his dream. The blood that was shed on that balcony in Memphis served to water our earth, and look what has grown from it. A tree is not known by who planted it, nor its position in the garden, but is known by the fruit that it bears. And look at the fruit of Martin's life.
Today, thousands of people come to visit Ebenezer Baptist Church. So many, in fact, that a much larger sanctuary was built directly across the street from the old church in 1999.
Well, we want to thank you for coming by, Ebenezer.
I thought that it would certainly be right for us to try to preserve the heritage, because people come here, I need to come here, they're here today, to see the place where Martin lived, because black people have not had too many heroes in this country that they could look up to. So we wanted generations of young people to be able to see him and know something about his history and be inspired by that. But at the same time, we had an ongoing congregation which needed to grow and develop. And so we decided to try to preserve the old church and build a new one. And there are those who come and see it as a tourist spot, who want to know if any of the members of the King family are here on a given Sunday morning. And one must wrestle with that a little and tell them, you know, that we really are here to serve the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and all of us are servants of his. It is a rich heritage, though, because Dr. King himself was dynamic.
He was a preacher of the gospel. And we try to take him out of that and make it wasn't a politician. It really wasn't a political movement. I mean, politics had to settle it finally, but it was a moral movement and a religious movement.
While we don't blame everything we did on God, everything good that happened because of the grace of God. Working through some weak and frail and ordinary people in many ways.
Without these people of faith, we wouldn't have been able to make it. Without these churches, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings.
And someone has said, those who forget the lessons of history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of history. And the white church and the black church, the church universal, the church militant, that's on its way to become the church triumphant, must somehow gird up its loins and prepare to help make a nation where all of us have the right to life and liberty, and not happiness, but at least the right to pursue it.
We shall not be moved. The African American Church, powerful, committed, immovable, from the shadow of slavery to the warm light of freedom, an agent for peace and justice in the hands of a loving God.